Final ANU 666 Canberra Federal Election Discussion Forum. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate. And I'd like to introduce Genevieve Jacobs, who is going to facilitate tonight's discussion forum. You all know Genevieve, no doubt, from the ABC, is it evening or afternoon?
Afternoons.
Afternoon. Well, they all blend into one for me, so yes. After lunch program. Tonight's topic is about our leaders, their parties and the politics of the 2010 federal election. Over to you, Genevieve.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And it is almost time, isn't it? It's almost finally just about time that we're going to decide who will be in charge for the next 3 years or so. And it's been such an odd sort of an election campaign so far. I mean, in winter, for one thing, which is unusual, but there's been this almost complete absence of detailed policy discussion. And that's been so interesting for us here in the media in Canberra, because detailed policy discussion is often what our audience is absolutely crying out for. They want to know what basis they're actually deciding the future of the country on. I've been talking to journalists at the end of each week who've been on the campaign trail just about the quirks and the ins and outs of what's happened, and they say there have been incredibly few opportunities for the politicians to meet the voters on the street. A real avoidance of those detailed, awkward questions about the direction in which each party intends to take us. So this collaboration between the ANU and 666 ABC Canberra has been particularly satisfying for that reason. We've had 3 completely booked out lectures on asylum seekers and refugees, immigration issues, the economy, the environment, and now tonight, leadership and policy. And we've been delighted to be able to collaborate in bringing you some of the very best brains at the ANU and to make this very public through the use of the ABC. First, a couple of ground rules though. I'll introduce you to our panellists in just a moment. We will have time for questions at the end. There'll be some roving microphones around, so if you'd like to ask a question, just make a note and catch my eye and we'll try to get a microphone to you. We'll allow about 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end of the day. But look, a warning about that. I want questions and not statements. Now, my usual line in these circumstances is just think of me as Tony Jones in a skirt. That will probably work pretty well. I won't be taking anything as a comment, though. I will be completely ruthless if you take an opportunity to grandstand about anything. Thank you. Among the issues we'll cover are how well the leaders of each major party have performed, the effect of the Gillard coup and whether there are discernible policy differences between the major parties, marketing strategies, the role of issues like gender, religion, and much, much more, including predictions from the panel about the outcome next Saturday. Please also make sure that your mobiles are silent. The forum's being recorded and you can also access the material on the 666 website, abc.net.au/Canberra. The 3 forums we've held so far are already there and this one will be up by some stage tomorrow when we can whack it into a bit of shape. On our panel tonight, Marian is Emeritus Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at the ANU and she's Vice President of the International Political Science Association. She's published widely on women in politics and on democratic theory and practice. In fact, the last time Marian and I saw one another was the day on which Julia Gillard became Prime Minister. Geoffrey Barker, on the end here, is currently Defence and Foreign Affairs columnist for the Australian Financial Review. He's a contributor to Australian Policy Online, the website of Swinburne University, and visiting fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, ANU. He's a former political correspondent as well, a news editor of The Age, an assistant editor there, European correspondent also for The Age, a Washington correspondent for the Herald and Weekly Times, foreign affairs and defence correspondent for the Financial Review. Andrew Hughes is one of Australia's leading experts on political marketing, having published extensively in that area. He's got a particular interest in the use of celebrities in political campaigns. Perhaps Mark Latham now fits under that banner. And in the branding of parties and leaders and the use of different advertising strategies in political marketing. He's also a regular guest on 666 Afternoons. I pick them well. John Wanner is the Ansog Foundation Professor for the Sir John Bunting Chair of Public Administration. He's formerly from Griffith University and his research interests include Australian and comparative politics, public expenditure, and budgeting and government business relations. Let's all welcome them and thank them for being here tonight, shall we? Okay, let's go to it. And Geoffrey Barker, I want to start with you this evening. You have called this campaign absolutely dismal. Why?
Well, I think the first thing I've noticed from the beginning is that the two parties, the main parties, have been seeking to make distinctions without real differences on the issues they are talking about, to the extent that they're talking about them. I'm also concerned that major areas of public policy, very important ones, particularly international policy, international security, foreign policy, just hasn't figured in the campaign at all. I suppose too, I've been a bit struck by the failure of both Gillard and, well, not the failure, the seriousness which Gillard and Abbott have tried to hide in the misty centre of everything, and it's just impossible. I think you try to sort out what they're saying about different policies, and really there's the differences when you look at them. It seems to me are largely cosmetic. Interesting one yesterday, I suppose. There was the 18th soldier killed in Iraq, and the first thing that happened was that Gillard and Abbott were both on television saying how strong they were to keep our troops there. There was no discussion about this matter at all, and there's been no discussion about a whole lot of other things, including some you mentioned.
Marian Sawyer, things were very different, really not very long ago at all. We were all galvanised and interested in one way or another by Julia Gillard's ascension to the Prime Ministership, those extraordinary events surrounding it. I'm wondering whether the ennui of this campaign, the boredom, has taken you by surprise, given that burst of energy.
I mean, I think it has taken me by surprise to some extent, but the cabinet leaks, which were aimed at discrediting Julia Gillard completely in terms of, whether she'd make a difference for women in Australia. I mean, that kind of dampened some of those happy expectations about having a woman Prime Minister, I think. But also, Julia Gillard's been very careful not to make anything of being the first Australian woman Prime Minister. And that means that she hasn't talked about a lot of things that might be of interest to women, like childcare policy, for example, where there are clear differences between Labor and the Coalition, or things like the equal pay case currently underway, which you'd think there might be quite significant differences between Labor and the Coalition. I mean, will the Coalition fund the big increases in pay for community service workers if the equal pay case is won and women are paid in accordance with their responsibilities and skills and qualifications as though they were in a male industry? I mean, this would mean a big increase in government budgets, but of course the Coalition in particular has been saying an awful lot about the cuts they're going to make to public sector expenditure. I mean, Labor's been making somewhat of a virtue of this as well. So, I mean, why aren't both sides being taxed on what they're going to do about equal pay for women?
Andrew Hughes, why not market yourself as Australia's first woman Prime Minister? What's wrong with that?
Nothing at all. I mean, why not? I mean, it's got a definite connection with the marketplace, and that's what you're after nowadays, is to get that connection with the market very quickly and to keep that connection strong all the way through the life of your term. But, I mean, the stronger the connection is too, the more loyal people are and the less likely they are to switch their vote the next time round. And I don't see any reason why you shouldn't market yourself like that.
But we haven't seen that happen at all, have we?
I mean, well, look, the other side of the coin, remember, is Tony Abbott's marketing himself as a very ochre male. The whole budgie smugglers and family man, exactly. And he's been quite proud of that. He's actually been out there saying, well, that's the market I appeal to, why not? So we may say that Julia Gillard's exploring that marketplace a bit, but it's no different to Tony Abbott.
We see Julia Gillard in a lot more hard hats though, don't we?
Yeah, look, definitely. And maybe a trend there from Kevin Rudd, who is known as the hard hat king. But she's got to get into that core market because Labor is starting to lose their core. And once your core starts to go, you have to get it back. Otherwise, you start to look at a train wreck election. And I think that's exactly what the decision was faced by the Coalition and why they went after Tony Abbott as leader for, was because they saw their core going and they need to get that core back. And he was the man to get the core back. He wasn't there, I don't think, to win the election. He was there to shore up the core and try and take it to Kevin Rudd. And of course, you know, the events of late June changed everything in the coalition playbook, because now he's seen, and he came across very early on as being quite hard against Julie Gillard.
So how will this have changed their plans?
I think deep down they went a little bit softer on Julie Gillard in the beginning of the campaign, but now they're going hard. The gloves have come off the last couple of weeks because the votes start to drift back again, particularly after that Brisbane meeting between Kevin Rudd and Julie Gillard, where I think for some people that was like laying down the swords in a way, the dispute between both of them. Although today, looking at the Labor campaign launch, Kevin Rudd way at the very, very back, I think row XX, and out of harm's way, so he wasn't a distraction, of course, which he wasn't going to be ever, right? But they've tried to keep that away from the spotlight and get that vote coming back a bit, because there is a lot of anger with their voters over how he was dealt with.
Mm-hmm. And we might talk about that more in just a moment, because I'm also really interested in the re-emergence of the silver bodgy. Yeah. Bob Hawke, more of him than we've seen in years. And even Bill Hayden, I noticed, got a run today at the campaign launch. But John Warner, you've called this the Punch and Judy show, this campaign. Would you like to say who's Punch and who's Judy?
I call it that because it's campaign sort of at two levels, well, at four levels really, but two levels in the crucial politics. It's basically a slugging out fight between two inexperienced leaders who are just sort of trying to make themselves more likeable. I mean, that's really all they've had to trade with in this election campaign. Imagery has been hugely important, not just the hard hats, but going around and the shopping centres. The constant. I mean, more babies have been kissed in this campaign than any since 1901. And at the second level, there's this negative campaigning between the parties behind the scenes. So you've got these people pretending to be nice and almost diplomatic to each other at one level, trying to woo voters across in a kind of positive, warm glow of aura. Behind the scenes then, much an increasing negativity. I think Julia Gillard thought she'd get a dream run, and I think there was a bit of misreading in the party about that. They took the view that she was a novelty character and her vote would go down as the months went on, so they had to go quick. But she looked a bit like a startled rabbit in the lights. She didn't look ready to go. The Labour Party didn't really have a lot of announcements to come out with quickly, and she thought she'd have a bit of a dream run in the first few weeks, and of course it didn't. It turned to sand, and so what we've seen in the last 2.5 weeks is a kind of resurrection campaign from Labour, with the coalition largely staying on the same message that they probably chose to stay on all the time. They stay on their track, and Labour's sort of zigzagging around trying to work out an angle to get something on them.
How do you think the general public responds to negative campaigning?
Well, generally, it's a good question, and if you go too negative, it turns people off. Yeah. So it's just getting that little umbra, I think this is a word, that little grey area where you suggest things. One of the best negative ads was the anti-Latham ad, where you didn't really say a great deal. There was just a few images and the L plate. And that was just subliminal enough to attack his inexperience. And they're using that again this time round, so obviously it was a good idea. But it's just enough to suggest a hint of uncertainty to voters, and that's successful. If we did negative ads like America, which really go tooth and nail for people, that wouldn't travel well with Australians. I think Australians want a fair go, want fair opportunities. They want to see both sides. They don't just believe negatives automatically in people. They want to hear what people got to say, including independents and small people too. So I don't think the negative is really strong. But it's interesting that that we're now not seeing many positive ads for parties, whereas we used to see positive ads for parties. Vote for us because of X. We're going to do this. We're going to do that.
Well, it's
we don't
time.
see that now.
The ultimate feel-good ad.
That's
it's
right.
time, which
That's
we can all still sing 40 years later. We haven't seen anything that will compare with that, have we?
No.
Marian, so just incidentally, where do we stack up in terms of representation of women in Parliament in an international sense?
Well, we've been slipping. We've slipped from 99. We're at 15th place internationally. Now we're at 33rd place in terms of representation of women in the national parliament. We actually share that place with Afghanistan. So it's kind of a fairly far cry from the beginning of the 20th century, when we were ahead of everyone else in terms of political rights for women.
Yeah, it's an interesting question when we compare ourselves with the Afghan parliament.
But interestingly, the most recent polls are not showing that women are supporting Gillard in quite the way I think the Labour Party thought they would. Gillard's got stronger support among the male demographics than among women. Now, they could swing back in the last few days of the campaign because there's a lot of undecideds out there and people who may change their vote in the last few days. So, we'll never actually know because we can't open the ballots, but it'd be interesting to see if any polling showed a greater return to women.
Well, I'm interested in what you all think of the Gillard coup, how she came to power. My sense from the radio is that people are quite cross about that. There are a number of people who said, well, I voted Kevin Rudd in and I'm pretty jolly irritated to be in this situation. Andrew?
Yeah, look, for sure. There's a lot of people who feel that disconnection all of a sudden, that Labor's cheated them out of a continuous connection with a strong brand. And it's a horrible feeling you get when you're a consumer and suddenly it's ripped away from you, this positive feeling you might have had with making a purchase. And it's been taken away and really replaced with something you go, hang on, this person, I didn't have to connect with them at all. I didn't vote for you guys to have her. And we're now seeing perhaps that was the reason why I think Labor went so early to the polls. I think they probably had a big decision to make. Look, do we go early with her now where she's still an unknown and the market doesn't know her and where there can't be traction against her by the coalition? Or do we hold back a bit and let the whole dismissal wash her out a bit, come out in the media a bit more and therefore not damage the Gillard brand? But they've decided to go early, of course, and history will tell us whether that was a good decision or not. But look, I think deep down there's still a lot of anger from people who are loyal to that brand that one of their brand champions was dealt with in that way. And particularly in Queensland, that's where the most damage will be done. And the indicators are it's going to be severe damage too. It's going to hit Labor quite hard. They won't get back down to, I think, the lowest representation ever in Queensland is 1 seat. Once upon a time, 2 seats, yeah, there you go. So we won't get to that level ever, but I think it's going to really, really hit home. Again, we saw today with the campaign launch, Wayne Swan front and centre. Swan doesn't have the same connection, though, with the marketplace as Rudd did. And Rudd still has got a very big following to the point where they stood up and applauded him as he walked in.
Yes, interesting to know that, John.
I think we have developed a culture where we don't pull down prime ministers easily and we give them a second and third go, but we change opposition leaders all the time. That's like getting someone off the substitute bench. They're not working, they're not kicking a goal, so let's get them someone else. So Abbott taking over, and remember he's the third, and if you say Costello was lined up almost the fourth post-Howard leader, it wasn't as contentious when he took over, even though the issue he took over was split Australians. I mean, we are not unified now on anything to do with climate change. A lot of uncertainty as a result of what the coalition did then. But it wasn't seen as a contentious issue, whereas when Rudd was knifed, I was in Queensland, and the mood was really palpable. Like, you don't do that. And I think Gillard's had to work really with that huge kind of overhang of this kind of nasty taste in everyone's mouth. And I think that's still one of the reasons why there's so many undecideds.
If there's a question... I'm sorry, go on, Geoffrey.
I was going to say, I agree with all of that, but there's one thing that really I think needs to be mentioned, and that was the internal dilemma the Labor Party faced with this. What you say, I agree with all of that, that the people had, the electorate had this view of it and they thought it was wrong and that it was something one didn't do or didn't do likely to prime ministers. But if you're managing the Labor Party from inside and you're seeing that the Prime Minister has created a situation within the government where if they don't make a change, it's the lesser of two evils problem they face. And they're all the interesting decisions we have. And I think that, the Labor Party faced the decision, if we don't remove this fellow now, this crazy, and it was crazy if you hear it from the inside, this control freak, quite unreasonable demands on colleagues, on civil servants, on the system, was such that I think, the Labor Party had to say, what's worse, taking the risk and risking all the things that you've talked about, or leaving him there and having another sort of catastrophe. So they really faced a lesser of two evils problem.
Although interestingly, Geoffrey Barker, of course, Kevin Rudd was the policy wonk par excellence, and what we're all talking about this election is the lack of policy. So it's been an interesting change in perceiving what the electorate might want.
Yes, because I think that's one of the reasons we're not seeing so much policy, because we don't have someone. I just think
that becomes an expectation issue too. I mean, you think you're across everything, you make all these promises, you raise everyone's expectations, and then in many areas, you don't deliver. You're getting in taxi cabs, and a taxi driver will say, Rudd hasn't done this, this, and this, and you think, it's just rhetoric, they don't know anything. And then they'll name 5 or 6 policy areas that he hasn't delivered on, and you think, no, this is sunk in. They're
That's exactly what I agree with you about that, because that Monday poll result which came out and showed Labor's primary vote at 33, I thought he was gone, because there was no way coming back from that, because 33 means they can't win the marginals. They need to be around 38, 39 to win the marginals and have a go at winning the election itself. But you're right, at 33, I think inside they would have thought, look, we take the risk, we lose 8 seats maybe in Queensland if we get rid of him, but we've got a chance at winning at least. If we keep him on, it'll be worse than 8 seats in Queensland. It'll be like a loss of government. So I think they rolled the dice and they've taken a gamble, and that's why he went so quick for, because they realised if we don't get rid of him now, we get seen as doing no action at all. What do we go to the people with and say what the reason is we need to get re-elected for? What reason did they have?
Well, Rudd had a lot of what I call fair weather friends in the Labor caucus. They really were there while he was delivering, and he wasn't Beazley. There was an ABC campaign, anyone but Beazley. So to get rid of him, and he was an alternative. But when he first ran against Beazley and didn't run, he and Gillard were talking about it. He only had 2 votes at that time. The support came to him by factional warlords, and it was fairly fickle and it was fairly thin. And it's interesting how his support disappeared in about 3 hours on that. Was it a Wednesday night? I can't remember. Tuesday or Wednesday night. It just disappeared in hours, and I think only 3 ministers and a couple of Queensland backbenchers were supporting him in the end.
And in fact, I think we were told that Julia Gillard had had the numbers for a long time.
Yes, that's right.
And really, he was a man of the moment. Well, let's get to the policy or the lack of it. And I'm wondering whether any of you think that either of the major parties have distinguished themselves in any way from each other. I mean, it has been a little bit of a gutless campaign in that sense, hasn't it, Geoffrey?
Well, that's certainly my view of it. I mean, even today, you're listening to Julia Gillard laying out this quite very long speech. You have to ask yourself, what did she really tell us at the end of it, except the things she believes? You can bore everybody for a long time telling them your beliefs. But, it was this sort of standard recitation about domestic issues like education, health, economic management. They all matter, but she didn't seem to have anything particularly fresh to say about them. She offered very little. Abbott is simply not even terribly... It seems to me that when you look at what Abbott's really saying, he's not disagreeing with her so much as saying, well, I agree roughly with that, but I'd do it better and I'd do it cheaper. But he can't get his numbers right, even in his own propaganda. And, I'm left with a feeling, a rather unpleasant feeling, that both of the parties have taken the view, well, this country's gotten through the GFC without too much pain. We don't need to worry. People are complacent, inward-looking, comfortable. We can just sell them a bill of goods like that. And so we don't discuss things that interest me, like, the serious international issues that are around at the moment. And so I guess I don't think either of them have distinguished themselves in policy. They either haven't discussed it or they've, as I said, they've just cleaved to the misty centre and tried to make distinctions without differences.
Well, we've seen almost no mention of foreign policy. Certainly, almost absolutely nothing about Indigenous affairs. That's been entirely silent when that was one of the issues on which John Howard tried to pin the last election. Nothing about defence today at the Labor campaign launch. What's missing, Geoffrey?
Well, not only those, you could add there was nothing today on climate change. And,
yes.
Certainly, I think this country, run my own private prejudices, but I think this country does need a serious debate on its position internationally. I think that we are in a situation in this region in the world where there are major long-term power shifts occurring in the world, particularly with the rise of China and India. We're seeing, China, we're in this curious position with China now where it's the source of our economic prosperity, but it's not in our sort of ideological or military interest group. We've seen it throwing its weight around increasingly. We see these issues right through the Middle East. For example, two of the most stabilising figures in the Middle East, Mubarak and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, are both very close to death's door. And when they go, goodness knows what's going to happen given the nature of the current Israeli administration. And that doesn't even mention Iraq and Afghanistan. So I just think there are a lot of these very big issues about Australia's long-term future and how it ought to position itself that really ought to be addressed and just seem to be set aside completely in this election campaign.
Perhaps, Geoffrey, the media are sometimes responsible for this lack of focus on policy issues. I mean, both parties did actually have initiatives in the disability policy area, but apparently at the launch of the coalition disability policy, not a single question was asked about those because people just wanted to ask questions about Kevin Rudd's role in the campaign.
Well, you've actually preempted my next question, Marian, which is, I think many people here will have seen that wonderful interview on Lateline with Jay Rosen, the very senior American professor of journalism, and he said, if the media can't make important ideas interesting, then whose job is it? And I'm wondering what you all think about how well the media has served us in this campaign, which is always my favourite question to ask on air. Andrew, to you first.
Look, I think the role of this media in the campaign has been very interesting because we haven't seen a lot of negativity at all against either leader. It's been quite flat, if anything. We haven't seen, because there's nothing to go on. They've been running both small target campaigns deliberately because of not just Kevin Rudd, but also they want to have that strategy of only positive news coming out about them and their policy announcements being quite strong. The only interesting thing I've seen is that who gets first in for the day for the announcement and get the headline and get the run for that day. And now seeing the human element come out through these current affairs shows. That's been one of the more interesting things. The Women's Weekly, for instance, was a masterstroke by Labor strategy because they had to get that brand known better. A lot of people we've asked who Julie Gillard was, are we going the real one or the other one? So, they had to really come out and say, look, this is who she really is. She's opening herself up a bit more to, get that connection into the marketplace because she doesn't have that strong connection. She's not a Kevin Rudd.
I'd suggest that one of the things that's also happening here is that both Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott are personally liked by many people who work in the press gallery at Parliament House. Yeah. But John Warner, what are you making of the media's approach to this campaign?
I think a long time ago the media decided it wasn't their job to promote the policies of the parties, that the parties should promote those themselves, and it was their job to be a cheer squad, a coach squad, critics, commentators, telling them how to move next as if it's a chess game. I think we massively over-intellectualise the campaign. I mean, some of the campaign things are very, what I call bog standard. You start off, you have the middle, beginning and end, and you just get through it. And we over-intellectualise constantly, particularly in the serious broadsheets and stuff about what's going on behind the scenes. And often it's just you toss a coin, we're just doing this or doing that, stick to some kind of broad strategy. So I don't think it's the media's fault that the election's not interesting. In fact, I think some of the media, Latham's antics and the like, have tried to sort of inject a bit of humour. I think it's been a really unusual campaign. There's some elements of this campaign that are like 1990 when, it's a slightly older audience. In 1990, it was a tired government. It went to the polls. It really looked like no one was interested in the election. And it was an election which wasn't a great deal about foreign policy or any big issues of the world. It was about domestic issues like most OECD elections now are. And it was a marginal seat campaign, and Labor struggled over the line. I think they lost the popular vote, but struggled over the line by just holding enough marginal seats. And we might be seeing a rerun of that the coalition vote, primary vote, is larger than Labor's, but Labor might just hold on to fighting that tight marginal seat campaign.
Well, look, let's take on the big crazy elephant in the media room that is Mark Latham, the sideshow that's probably been one of the most enlivening things that's happened all campaign. And that was that wonderful question on Q&A, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a tool is that Mark Latham? Geoffrey, what are you making of Latham's odd intervention in the campaign?
Well, I think it's essentially a commercial judgment by the Nine Network to get somebody who they knew was that sort of person, aggressive, combative, controversialist, to try and get him to to inject some life and put on some sort of public performance and get some pictures they can show on television, because that's what they're interested in. And I suppose to some extent he did it, but the problem with Mark Latham is that, you know, he's a highly intelligent man without an ounce of judgment. And, so it ends up with him just appearing to be brutal towards Gillard, particularly as he was with Howard when he was the opposition leader a few years ago. And I think that he's finally discredited himself with this declaration that people shouldn't cast a vote. I mean, you can't be in that game and in the media game at any place and then pretend that it, you know, it doesn't matter. You don't have to. I think he sort of cancels himself out of any serious contention. But for television pictures, for the bogan electorate that likes to watch 60 Minutes, I suppose he's a good commercial asset.
Well, who knew that Pauline Hanson would be an issue at this election? That was one of the more extraordinary moments. Marian, so Julia Gillard is an atheist. She's been quite frank about that. That's a very rare declaration these days in Western politics. Has religion played a role in the campaign at all?
Well, it's played some role. How much effect it has, I don't know. I mean, the Australian Christian Lobby, of course, has said it's not appropriate for someone with Julia Gillard's lifestyle to be in the lodge, an inappropriate role model for others, and so on. And of course, Cardinal Pell has said that the Greens are unchristian or anti-Christian and so on. So there've been some strong interventions, but speaking for the most conservative parts of the religious spectrum, unfortunately, I think Australian politics has not got to the point of American politics where it is mandatory for our leaders to be seen attending church with well-groomed children and wife in tow. So, I mean, I hope that doesn't come anytime soon, frankly.
There's a religious irony in this election campaign, because a few years ago we abolished the school chaplains model when the federal government was funding school chaplains to save money, because it was regarded as a waste of money. And now she's announced that they're going to re-establish school chaplains.
Well, Bill Heffernan, of course, famously accused Julia Gillard of being deliberately barren. Have her personal circumstances hampered Labor's ability to play the family card? Marian?
Well, I mean, I think it's the coalition that's been anxious to play the family card. I mean, Tony Abbott's been telling us that he knows what it's like to bring up a family and so on. So, you know, positioning himself alongside ordinary mums and dads who, you know, are the target voters. So I think that obviously Julia Gillard's had this family deficit. I mean, but on the other hand, today she had a mother and father and partner at the policy launch.
Nieces and nephews.
Yes, there were. Yes, nieces and nephews. There were a lot of Gillard family lined up, weren't there?
So you know, so she's been making up for her family deficit. But I mean, I think that a lot of that has rebounded. The attempt to depict Julia Gillard as out of touch with ordinary Australians because, you know, she has a very clean kitchen and doesn't cook and has no spouse or children. I mean, I think that hasn't washed.
Well, we get to that point about the underdog and the fair go, don't we, when people are perceived as being attacked for something which is a completely legitimate choice in life. John?
And there's no normal family circumstance now. We have to remember that the dad, mum and 2 kids is less than 20% of the families now. So people are living in different arrangements on their own, sometimes in couples and sometimes one parent with children. So it's a very different mix out there. So I think it's a difficult card for anyone. I think we've been mature enough to keep off most of the negatives in that kind of debate. I think that's good.
Well, let's look at where this election really will be fought, which is in the marginal seats, and not in any way in this extremely safe Labor seat in which we sit at this very moment. But Andrew, I'm wondering how you think the preferences will really play out in the marginals.
Oh, very, very important, because the Greens' primary vote's been so high this election. It hasn't come down a lot.
And what's the significance of that Green primary vote?
Well, you're looking at roughly an 80-20 preference flow through to Labor. And that really helps them out through a tight contest in the marginals. When it comes down to the fact that the primary vote for the coalition will be a lot higher than Labor in most seats, as John said before, I think their primary vote will be far, far higher than the Labor for sure. It comes down to the point of how the preferences get distributed, because in a tight contest, if they have the preferences going their way, and look, they don't all go Labor's way, but most of them do, then they get across the line. And that's usually how they do get across the line and win the marginals. So if that preference flow, though, doesn't go on historical records, which is 80-20 roughly, and maybe it splits a little bit differently, then they're in trouble.
Anthony, I mean, there's two things I want to make. One is the passing of the Democrats is important because when you used to have tight seats and you got Labor, Liberals, say, and they're fairly close, 48% each or 46% each, and you've got the Democrats sitting there. The Democrats bounced around a bit and didn't go one direction. But if you look, say, at Bennelong last time, it's a good example. Not many people know or realise that Howard actually beat Maxine McHugh on the primary vote. Beats her by 1,500, nearly 2,000 votes. But when you're looking at where the preference flow is going to come, there's 6,000 Green votes out there and nobody else. Now they piled straight back in, 70%, something like that, to Maxine McHugh, and she won the seat on Green preferences. I think Bob Brown made a statement that something like 25 seats or something had been determined, of Rudd's seats, had been determined by Green preferences, and so he should have a seat at the cabinet table. Rudd took no notice of him. So it's that's changed in the landscape of politics, that a centrist party, which was the biggest deliverer of preferences, has been replaced by a Green party, which is a mixture of moderate to left, which is now the deliverer of preferences to the parties. And that's the change we're seeing in this election. It's also why Labor's primary vote's been peeling off, because Labor is losing left-Green votes to the Greens.
Especially in the inner-city marginals. That's where they're losing their vote the most.
Well, where should we be looking? Where will this be decided? Eden Monaro is the archetypal bellwether. I think that seems less certain this time around. Mike Kelly seems to have dug himself in. But in the West, in Western Sydney, where's this election going to be won?
Parramatta's a good seat to look at. Parramatta's a very, very influential seat to see who takes government. It's never really won by a big margin. It usually goes with the government of the day. But also, looking at it from a marketing point of view, it's usually the most representative seat of everyone in Australia. If you want to look at a sample of Australian population, you go to Parramatta.
Bog standard.
And Westfield, in fact, did research on that, and that's why they build a massive shopping centre there, because they can get as many people as they can in that area. And that's why Parramatta's a good one to look at for Western Sydney. So whoever wins that, and it's a close contest this time around for sure, may take the government, and that's one to look at in Western Sydney.
The irony is I think we're going to have a sort of an election of two parts, with basically Queensland and New South Wales being one kind of election, and then the rest being a much more mixed. We may find a push towards the coalition in Western Australia. South Australia may come in about line ball, and Tasmania the same. Western Sydney is not that important in terms of seats. It's symbolic, I think. It's where a lot of focus polling is being done. It's where there's a lot of worries about congestion. A lot of Gillard's messages are messages that are going to resonate in Western Sydney. But if you look at New South Wales marginal electorates, they're scattered up the coast right up to Page. And if you look at Queensland, they're not, apart from Brisbane, which has now become marginal because of the seat distribution, most of the marginal electorates in Queensland are sort of northern and outer metropolitan Brisbane, and then spotted right up the coast right to the Cape, right to Leichhardt, which would probably fall to the coalition, I would have thought. So that's where the territory is going to be. Coastal areas, battles between retirees, tree huggers, Nappy Valley, that's the territory that they're fighting. And it's why most of the political leaders have been chomping that territory. The seats of Longman, which the coalition may have shot themselves in the foot by putting a very young, inexperienced candidate against a fairly well-known former state member who's a sitting member. So incumbency will be an important factor here. You've got to remember, in some of the Queensland seats last time, with a late pro-Rudd swing, some of the seats were swinging 15 to 17%. Now that is an unusually large swing, and you would normally expect to see just some correction coming back in that Rudd's not there anymore now. There's been a change of government. They've got rid of Howard, and so there may be a conservative, just normal coming back of a pendulum.
If we go back to the Greens for a moment, Marian and Geoffrey, if I can put this to you, do you think that Bob Brown is perceived as providing the kind of moral leadership and certainty that we haven't seen from the leaders of the other two major parties? Geoffrey?
Well, yes, I do, because I rather like Bob Brown, actually, and I think he addresses those green issues in a way that's generally fairly sensible and moderate. which you can't say of a lot of other members of the Green Party. Frankly, I think that's his problem. It's the rank and file. I think Bob, in terms of appeal to voters, is probably seen as a reasonable, decent, middle of the road fellow who's at least articulating, deep concerns about things like, the climate change, the whole greenhouse gas thing, which the two major parties have squibbed shamelessly. So I think he's probably seen as a person for whom people might think, they can vote. And I certainly, as the other chaps have said, it makes it very easy for disaffected Labor voters to make a protest vote, and knowing that the preference will take it back to Labor, so they can make a point to Labor fairly safely in many seats.
Marian, does Bob Brown come across as a bloke you can trust? Is that part of his appeal?
Yeah, I think he's a very appealing leader. I think he is seen as more authentic than the major party leaders in many respects, less involved with spin, and not associated with all that kind of backroom manipulation. Though of course there is manipulation in the Greens, and so we shouldn't be too starry-eyed about that. But I think he does come across as very authentic, and it's interesting what's happening with this strong Green support in the electorate at the moment. I mean, it will bring more women into the federal parliament, of course. The Greens do that, and they've already got more women than men in the Senate, and they'll have even more women. So it will be, quite a feminised parliamentary presence there. Whereas you can't say that of the major parties, where everything's stagnating. If there were a 3% even swing to the coalition, which of course is not going to be for all the good reasons that John and Andrew have just been talking about. If there was an even swing to the coalition, we would go down that interparliamentary union ranking of countries even further. We would be below Afghanistan, because the number of women in the House of Representatives would fall if there was an even swing to the coalition.
It's always interesting to note, it's very easy to get the Greens to appear on radio. It's enormously easier to get them to talk about things than it is either Labor or the coalition. All right, before we ask questions, we open the floor to questions, let's just see what you all think is going to happen. Andrew, your prediction?
Labor to win by under 5 seats.
Okay. Yeah. John?
I think that the Liberals will hold most of their seats that have been nominally declared Labor, because a lot of boundaries have changed in New South Wales and Queensland. I think there's going to be a big swing, or a reasonable swing against Labor in Queensland. Some swings in New South Wales, but I think Labor will just hold on. Maybe it'll be an even number probably, so it'll be 4, 6, 8 seats, something like that. They have now a numerical majority of 16.
Okay, they'll squeak it in. Marian?
Well, I'm not a psephologist, so I'm not going to risk my reputation making this kind of prediction. I will defer to my colleagues on the panel.
All right. And Geoffrey?
Well, I'm not a psephologist either, but I covered my first federal election as a very young reporter was 1961. And in that election...
yes, that's right.
It was extremely close.
In that election,
yes.
Bob Menzies lost, I think, 15 seats. And Arthur Caldwell got 15 seats, and Menzies just clung to power by 2 seats. And without any insight or great confidence, I think that sort of order of result is likely, as Andrew and John said, that's going to be roughly the order of it. Labor will hang on significantly diminished.
All right, well, we end with the prediction that Pig Iron Bob and Julia Gillard have got something in common. That may be the first time this has come up in the campaign.
Just on that one, Killen always reckoned that Menzies had said, "Killen, you're the magnificent, Killen the magnificent," and Fred Daly reckoned Killen had said that about himself.
Apparently it wasn't true.
All right, look, let's open the floor to some questions, and just catch my eye, and we'll get the microphone to you. And yes, we'll start up there.
Sure. At a community forum much like this one, a ACT federal representative was talking about broadband, and she said the politicians struggle talking about broadband because they talk about megabits and this and that, and they're not tech heads and whatnot, but they can't actually quantify the real effect it has on people, and the media struggle with it for the same reason. But not far from just this region, we find towns where people feel like second-class citizens because they are just locked out of access to what is the main way that people not only get information, education, and today we've heard the Prime Minister talk about healthcare. This is, for me, as a young person, but not necessarily as a young person, just as a citizen that wants basic access to services, the biggest difference between both parties. I think it's the biggest policy difference. Do you care to comment on the stark differences we have between the Coalition's policy and Labor's plan for broadband?
Who wants to take that on?
I think it is the biggest difference by far, and certainly in terms of price. It will be important. I mean, what we're not talking about is most people will use it to download films faster, but it is important for small businesses who feel that their electronic equipment drops out all the time.
It's interesting that that's been something that's aroused quite passionate talkback on the radio. People are deeply concerned about it.
But by and large, it'll be a leisure. It'll be a leisure issue.
Yeah. Okay.
I would say Labor's got on a winner with that issue. I think that the Coalition's response, which is, you know, National Broadband Light, 6 billion or something, it really just seems pretty paltry in comparison.
In fact, it's sometimes impossible to get good broadband, good internet access in Pialigo, which is hardly the boondocks. You can nearly see Parliament House from Pialigo. Yep.
Okay, you've framed the discussion very much in terms of a two-party debate, and also you don't think you've actually mentioned young people. And those are two very closely related issues in the sense that the big shifts are taking place from young people 18 to 24 to the Greens. And it's kind of interesting that both the major political parties are ignoring young people, and that's partly why you've got a big shift. And I think, are we perhaps seeing a shift towards three parties? If you look at what's happening in the young generation, it's 1 in 5 voters nationally on average. That's probably 1 in 3 in particular electorates. So for many young people, the Greens are one of 3 major parties they're making a choose from. If that shifts generationally, we're looking at a shift to 3 major parties in the debate.
It would have to be a shift within the House of Representatives, though, wouldn't it, to really wield effective political power?
Yeah, look, I tend to agree with that. There is a bit of a sea change happening with the way the younger generation are viewing the Greens and have that connection with the Greens locally. And we're seeing that in seats like Melbourne and even in Brisbane, up in the north, where people have that strong connection, that young generation coming through. And probably it's a sign of changing demographics to an Australian society where people are staying single a lot longer in life. They're not getting married and settled down and moving to the burbs so quickly. And so for them, there's different issues which are more important now for a lot longer in that early stage of their life. Whether we'll see that go across the entire electorate, I think will be a lot longer in mindset to happen. I don't think we'll see it in the next 10 years for sure. The market doesn't move that quick, but it will move. And I think after this election, one thing we'll notice is the rise of the Greens, because they will have balance of power in the Senate. They will be seen up front and centre a lot more than what they ever have been. And it's a big responsibility. The last party which had balance of power lost it and then lost themselves. And so this is the chance for the Greens to make that connection with their market and grab a new market. And I think we've started to see some baby steps, as it were, by the Greens to move into the mainstream of policy areas. Things like bank fees. I heard a policy announcement made by the Greens about bank fees and ATMs. And I thought, wow, this is the party known for the environment talking about economic and bank policy. And I thought, great, this is what we need to see. We need to see more competitive marketplace. I think over time they might start to become more like, say, the LDP is in the UK, becoming a more significant third party and definitely overtaking the role of the National Party, who people forget are our third party at the moment. And I think we'll see them take over that, because they'll also get, if they, my prediction is they'll win Melbourne on Saturday and have lower house representation for the first time in their own right without having to win a by-election where one of the major parties steps aside in that contest. And so I think if they get the lower house seat, they start to get a lot more influence as well and a lot more attention. And that makes the connection with the marketplace, because at the moment, there are still a lot of young people out there who just go, I love the money. I love the cash. I want to hear about economic growth and prosperity, and, they have that connection still to the major parties. either for their occupation or their family background or where they live, whatever it happens to be. But if the Greens this time round get it happening, and I think they will, then they've got 3 years to really make an impact in the market. They need to be taken seriously. And it's time for them to start doing serious things on policy in areas other than the environment.
Just to pick up on Andrew's market language, you might see that the Greens is repositioning themselves with their Denticare policy to attract more older voters. And indeed, I heard a spokesman for Seniors Australia suggesting that older Australians are now also more interested in the Greens, which hasn't been the case in the past.
There's also about 1.1 million extra voters this time around from last time. There's about 12.8 last time. It looks to be about 14 million people who vote this time. A lot of those will be younger voters coming onto the ballot for the first time. I agree with you, there hasn't been much, but if you look at the age sampling, the group that seems to be most fickle is that group that's a bit over the younger, the early, family.
25 to 34.
That's right, yeah, into that group. And they're the ones, house prices, mortgage, children, that's the group that's been more politically fickle at the moment.
Okay. I think our next question was somewhere, the microphone up here. Yep.
Yeah, look, you mentioned the It's Time campaign, and as a young teenager, I can remember things that government did. Big things, taking troops out of Vietnam, free education and whatnot. I'm struggling to think of what governments have done since then. And is it just my impression that their successive governments are getting less and less courageous? And now I think climate change, it's a trump card sitting there to grab, and they don't. Can you comment on it?
What's happened to Vision?
Well, just a point. McMahon actually brought the troops out of Vietnam and Whitlam basked in the glory of it. But he was pressured. I think you've got to remember that the Whitlam government is a very unusual government. We come out of the Second World War, we have a whole string of conservative governments that do things, but do things in a very straight conservative kind of way. And we had a lot of sort of social democratic pent-up policies and enthusiasm that hit us in one go, whereas if you look at most other OECD nations, they'd had changes of governments more regularly, and so the other side had to go. So Whitlam's a kind of a bit of an afterthought where a lot of stuff's put on the table in one go, and it was a bit too much for that government to digest. They lasted 3 years with an election, after 2. And it's probably one of our most incompetent governments. But on the other hand, it's probably a government that introduced a hell of a lot of policy still in existence, trade practices and all these kinds of things that stayed in. Governments have become more domestically focused. I mean, they're worried about your family homes, your incomes and stuff like that, superannuation. They've become much more attuned to the sort of hip pocket feelings of not just the marginal extras, but Middle Australia, and that's their focus. Now, if that makes them less adventurous, less visionary, well, that's also what you're telling them back.
The other point to note too is that back then I think people in politics had a lot more ideals than now, because now it's about winning the election. It's just that's what it's about. You get across the line, and it's very market driven and market focused. Hence why there's people like me around, because it's all about understanding what you need to do to get that segment of the marketplace coming across to you and keeping it until election day, and then winning that race for the election. And then the permanent brand management campaign, continuous campaign now we call it, because it goes on even in government. We see people out there on the hustings basically. The election campaign started January 1st this year. And I think that's changed a lot differently now. It's not about division anymore, it's about winning. And I hate to say it like that, because for a lot of people they go, oh, why? But look, maybe I say the other side of the coin is then at least they are market focused, which is us. We are the market, and we speak a lot louder. And one thing they learnt from Rudd's rise and fall, I think, is that if you don't treat the market with respect, the market will not respect you and turn on you. Which is why we saw in seats like Longman in 2007 such massive swings against Howard, because it was like, no, we supported you. You said you've got to look after us, and you come up with work choices. And then the market just went, no, sorry, we're not buying that at all. Same thing with Kevin Rudd. He promised a lot. And look, his public servant background came out because he went into a lot of detail on his policies, which is fantastic. But it tripped him up in the end because people went, hang on, you said you could do this and exactly this, and it hasn't happened, why not? and he tripped over himself, and so the market turned against him, hence why primary vote figures of 33%. So in other words, 2/3 of us hated him. And that's what people forget. I mean, is it any wonder the Labor machine men moved against him so quick? Should we be that shocked?
I'm thinking of the Whitlam government as like Christmas lunch. Fond memory, but everyone had to lie down for quite a while afterwards. I think our next question was up here.
There was an enormous amount of support for saying sorry. Why have Indigenous issues fallen off the agenda?
That's an interesting one. Who'd like to? Marian, would you?
And why hasn't there been more media complaint about Indigenous issues falling off the agenda? I mean, neither of the major parties have been promoting Indigenous policy, just like neither of them have said anything about women's policy. There is no women's policy this time. You know, there are a couple of announcements by Gillard in the National Plan for Reducing Violence Against Women and Children, which has a strong Indigenous component to it, and also the policy about women in boards, but nothing, in general about reducing gender gaps. Nothing, no vision, no women's policy. And the same with the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party did have one in 2007. They didn't launch it, but they snuck it onto their website so as to say they had one.
Why doesn't Indigenous policy sell when John Howard really tried to sell the entire election last time on the intervention in the Northern Territory? That was the tamper that was pulled out of the box last time, which didn't work.
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's partly, as Andrew says, if you have the domination of market attitudes and ideas and market theory on politics, you have to conclude that the people who run the party have just decided, there are no votes in Indigenous policy, thanks very much, or the people who vote for it are all going to vote one way and they won't vote the other way, so there's no real point in doing it. The second goes to the point that Marian just made, and that is, this rising complacency in both parties in this country. That there's this. I just have the sense that they really look at the population. They have their focus groups, and they work out what'll get what'll create some sort of frisson of interest in the electorate, and apart from that, there's no real interest in that sort of thoroughgoing and historic reform much anymore on either side. I mean, Julia said, didn't she, that after the first terrible couple of weeks that the real Julia was going to come out from now on. Well, I can't see a difference between old and new Julia.
Well, I don't think there's been enough emphasis on her actual policy achievements in government. I mean, with Fair Work Australia, I mean, major industrial legislation to undo work choices and so on, and do a number of other things at the same time. I mean, why has there not been any focus on those big achievements?
Well, I think she's focused. I mean, it's been pretty well. I think one of the strong themes that's come through the campaign, from the Labor side, is we got rid of work choices, and it was so effective that Abbott had to come out and make his declaration that it was dead and buried. True or false? I'd be very sceptical about it, but I think it has been there.
But it seems to me that's been about Abbott would bring back work choices. It's not about what Julia Gillard did in policy terms in government.
She's gotten big credit for
but
that.
The main reason why we haven't seen that happen is because, for the simple reason, she wasn't the Prime Minister who did it. And that brings back into play again Kevin Rudd, the man who is not a distraction, really, he isn't. He's just really a big distraction. So, and he's really hurting.
We dare not speak his name.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point. He had to be quiet because he was hurting Labor so much. And he was really dragging him down because people just saw this ghost of a Prime Minister so recent in our time. And in most of our memories too, most people, punters out there, will not know their local Member of Parliament. But they all remember Kevin Rudd's demise. And they still have that in their heads. And so that connection's still there. So if we start talking about what Julia Gillard did as Deputy Prime Minister, well, people start thinking, hang on, who was the Prime Minister? Who was the one who pushed these things through? So those leaks which came out, which are very, very targeted at where she was strong in the market. So the one on paid parental leave, wow, bang, dynamite. Because, I'm after the family vote. I've got a family, but I'm the modern Australian family, just me and my partner. And my mum and dad, I understand family. And then bang, no you don't because you're against paid parental leave. Bang, no you don't because you're against an increase in the pension rate. And it just really, it was seen to really hurt Labor. And, you know, since those leaks have stopped, we've seen the vote trickle back, but it has trickled back.
I think policies towards Indigenous people get regarded by both sides of politics as kind of in the wicked problem basket. And so it's perhaps best not to talk about it too much in public. And we'll do things behind the scene, and we've got the COAG Review Council doing reports on whether we're closing the gap. But that's invisible and no one's talking about it on the popular stage. What I suppose surprises me with this election is we haven't seen we haven't seen much debate about the bigger demographics, pensioners, you know, the self-funded retirees, tax policy, which was a big one in 2007. So there's big demographics there that we haven't been addressing because nobody has any money, and so no one wants to raise any expectations as part of the campaign.
Let's have just a couple more questions because I'm conscious of the time. Yep, here.
You mentioned the importance of key seats in Western Sydney. I was in Parramatta just this morning, and you couldn't help but walk around Westfield and just see how much of a multicultural hub it is now, whereas 10, 15 years ago it wouldn't have been. Can you explain why the major parties' campaigns are so Anglo-centric?
Yeah.
I suppose it's a really good question to ask because you're right. I mean, we're meant to be a multicultural society, right? And yet we see, again, in the representatives too of the major parties, mainly Anglo-Saxons running for representation. And, you know, is it a big question of involvement, how they're getting people involved in the brand itself, or is it just we're too still old-fashioned and conservative in our politics? And I like to think, really, we still are too old-fashioned and conservative because I want us to change now. I want political parties to become more, you know, representative of people out there, but also engage with people out there. And a lot of people I know get turned off politics. And there's very few people I know really that switched on to politics. Maybe all of us in here, maybe at the moment, you still see there's empty seats in here tonight. So it really says that perhaps a lot of people out there are switched off and don't feel they have the power to make change within political parties. And look at stakeholder influence within political parties themselves. If you're a union group, you have massive power in the ALP. If you're a business group, you have massive power for the coalition. If you're an ag group, you have massive power in the National Party. If you're ACF or the Wilderness Society, you have massive power in the Greens. So, you know, I think maybe we're looking at a time for sea change within the democratic system itself, to get more people involved, to look at why we're not getting more people involved in political parties. I mean, I think the Labor Party membership nationally, and don't quote me on this exact figure, is roughly only maybe 30,000.
It's less than one of the AFL clubs.
Yeah. And you think about it, so, you know, less than 30,000 people are basically selecting who's going to be running as a representative for their party and then run for the highest job in the country.
I mean, maybe it's also a question of scale too, that the federal electorates are so big now, 120,000, that it does float up to that dominant culture level. At the state level, you do see more multicultural representatives and more emphasis on multicultural as part of the campaign, and that's probably because they're closer to their electorates.
I think you have to ask too, what's in it for politicians? And a very senior ABC journalist said to me last week that he could not understand why your erstwhile colleague Andrew Leigh was bothering to run for Parliament. He said, here's a man with a Harvard PhD, a full professor at the age of 35. What on earth is in it for him as a backbencher for the next couple of years? And it's a fair question. I think we'll make this the last question. Up here, please.
I just have to wonder, why is the Gillard coup still an issue? I mean, it's one of the possibly less unpleasant facts of the parliamentary system, but it's not the first time that a Prime Minister has been replaced mid-term. Like, in no way is it the first time. So why is it still an issue? Is it because our system has become more presidential? And if so, why is that?
Okay.
Well, I mean, is it part of, you know, this emphasis on character and personality rather than policy? Is that what we're thinking here?
Yeah, look, I think our system's moved towards being presidential because we've made, you know, that system become like that. If you ask most people now who they're voting for, they say, you know, Julie Gillard or Tony Abbott. They won't say anymore Liberal Party, National Party, Greens or Labor. And you do it yourself. Do it as an exercise yourself. Go and ask people who would they vote for, and they'll say the person and not the party. And really the emphasis has moved on to people in politics. And we've made the person now the brand as well. You don't have that connection anymore with the party. It's now with the person. So you can transfer that connection with you as well. If you move, we talk about that 18 to 24-year-old demographic, they're very transient. They stay in a job maybe 1-2 years because they want something better, they want the work-life balance exact. So they take that connection with them though when they do transfer. So it's what we're seeing, a change in how we interact as well as consumers in the political marketplace. I know I sound like a marketing guy all the time, but I am. Because that's how people make that connection though. It's now at the personal level. And even though we're not a presidential style of government, because unless you're in Tony Abbott's seat or Julia Gillard's, you're not going to directly vote for them. But we now have that connection with them personally. You name to me maybe 3-4 other people from each side who've campaigned struggling this time around. I'm struggling. I'm thinking maybe Wayne Swan for Labor. And yeah, there's been a few out there for sure, but not many because they're managing their brand on the leader. Because they want you to make the connection with the leader and then to the party. Because that way, also, if you think about the change of leadership and change of people, well then that connection's broken and you go from one to the next. And I can build it up more quickly with a person than I ever can with the party. That party identification takes such a long period of time to build up for most people. But with a person, it's so quick. I can do it very, very quickly.
Geoffrey, you had...
I was just going to say there's a very simple answer to your question as to why the Gillard coup is still an issue. It was a very dramatic event. It was unexpected. People have memories, I'm astonished you think it can just be pushed back and doesn't count anymore because it happened a month ago. Political memory matters, and it was a very dramatic event in the political life of the country. And that's why it's still an issue.
I mean, it's only happened 3 times since the war, which is, it's a very unusual event. I mean, I think if I was cynical, I'd say Australians like to remove prime ministers themselves rather than their party hacks do it for them. But, when Gorton was brought down, that was a hugely traumatic issue for the Liberal Party. It was brought down by McMahon and they didn't get on. And then McMahon went to lose the election to Whitlam. Then you get the next traumatic event, which is Hawke to Keating, and with the Kirribilli Pact and all that. And that was a hugely traumatic thing. Labor members of Parliament came up and said afterwards, God, what have we done? He then won the 93 election, which was the unlosable one for the coalition. So, these are huge rupture points in the polity.
And with that, let's please thank our speakers, Andrew Hughes, John Warner, Marian Sawyer and Geoffrey Barker.
Before you all disappear, I'd like to thank you all for coming and remind you that you can actually see the whole 4 forums on the ANU YouTube. And I'd like to thank Genevieve with a nice bunch of flowers because she got wine last time.
Thank you. Oh, that's lovely. That's very nice. Great. Okay. And thank you all too. You're a marvellous audience.